Now, another one-on-one interview with a congressman defending his record against an upstart challenger, Steve Pearce. Pearce won the 2nd Congressional District seat in the U.S. House of Representatives after abandoning it during an unsuccessful run for the Senate. He's back and determined to keep his seat in Congress. Congressman Pearce, for years, federal funding has been the foundation of New Mexico's economy. Everybody knows this: military bases, our labs, highway money. In fact, our governor came out recently and said we needed to lessen our dependence on the federal government, as you know. You've said the same in the past. But this seems fundamentally at odds with your view of government. Is there something that we could be doing in this state, or in your district rather, that makes this less so?
Well, first of all, the idea that it's fundamentally different from my viewpoint, I think, should be examined. I absolutely support national defense. It's one of the constitutional requirements for the federal government. And New Mexico has a lot of federal land that is not available to us to have jobs and to make our economy grow. So absolutely support the funding needed to support these installations, because they're important not only for New Mexico but for the nation. So just looking at that needs to be examined. But then the second piece of it is, what can we do in this state? Just left a briefing where we're seeing that New Mexico's oil and gas economy is literally changing the economics for the entire country. The investment that is going on, the job creation in the southern part of the state, the tax base from that end of the state is driving the budget into a surplus position. So I think that we should be doing everything that we can for the private creation of jobs, but I don't have any problem going to the federal government and saying that you need to compensate New Mexico for these programs that are going on inside our state.
On the other side of that is, of course, the private sector. And for the 2nd Congressional District, can you point to a couple of private businesses where you've been able to witness them moving from government-supported businesses and more into the private side?
Well, there are some things that will not transition easily. In other words, national defense is not going to transition from public to private. But I think that if we're looking right now, for instance, in the timber industry, we could be cutting trees instead of burning our national forests, and that would be creating jobs in the local markets in areas in New Mexico. The processing of those trees would then move to the little bit larger towns. So there are a lot of projects, a lot of things that we can do to create jobs in this state, and we should be doing those. But again, sometimes the government is standing in the way. Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the fiscal cliff, the so-called fiscal cliff, as a way of explanation, not to you, but to viewers. Automatic cut provisions devised during those negotiations over the debt ceiling we all remember. Now, if no cuts are agreed upon, the automatic ones, more than $1 trillion, are to be made. Is that a smart plan or a necessary plan, or have we backed ourselves in a corner here?
I thought it was a horrible plan. I voted against the underlying bill, which said that we're going to create a super committee. I think that we in the House of Representatives and the Senate are the super committee. But what that Committee of 12 did is leave all the other districts that were unrepresented without a voice. Thought the process was bad. I felt the outcome was going to be bad, and so the sequestration, the cutting of funds to the military, $1 trillion over the next 10 years, is a horrible idea, and one in which I think both parties back themselves into a corner. I do not think, with the instability in the world right now, I don't think we should be cutting our funds for national defense. We should find different places to cut. I don't mind cutting the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, the bureaucracy. But men and women that are committing their lives to fighting for our way of life absolutely should not cut them while they're in combat.
Mm-hmm. What's your sense or your take as the fiscal impact of this in the 2nd Congressional District? Do you have a sense of how impactful this could be?
Yes, we've got military installations all through White Sands, Holloman, NASA is there, and so we're looking at significant cuts. We've got a lot of contractors that work in the 2nd District, again, working on future generation weapons or whatever it is that they're developing. And all of those are already starting to see the threats of major cuts in their workforce. And so we're doing what we can to see that the missions in New Mexico are on the drawing board, and that we protect those. It's a very big fight, though, in Washington right now. Mm-hmm.
Let's move to entitlements and reform of those entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And specifically, without cutting benefits to those recipients, can we get to some kind of fiscal squareness here, or are we going to have to really make some draconian cuts in those? Where do you come down on that?
Well, as a business owner, just working in our business, we always cut away from operations and move toward operations, and we could do the same thing with our government. Right now, both the CBO and OMB tell us that there's about 20% fraud. That's fraud, not waste. That's people selling things illicitly and illegally into the Medicare and Medicaid systems. Those combined programs, if we just stop the fraud, would save the government in the neighborhood of $1 trillion over the next 10 years. It's a massive amount, and one that we should be targeting directly. Again, we're presenting these requests that our leadership start attacking the fraud. But yes, there are significant ways that we can save money without going straight at recipients. I don't think that there's a mood in Washington to start cutting people off the support they need, but we've got to start balancing our budget. Mm-hmm. The fact that we have not, that the Senate and the White House really hasn't given us a budget in 4 years is unthinkable to me. Every family sits around their kitchen table and establishes a budget, and yet we're not doing that in this country because of the Senate and the White House. And so those fundamentals of how we would go about saving the money are critical. But I would start in those two major entitlement programs and just the fraud.
Mm-hmm. Let's go way far away from that to Iran. Very different subject here. And I want to get some sense of clarity about your support for military action and what that would take to have you agree to do that, and push that up against what looks like could be working, which is sanctions. They're clearly having a huge drop in the value of their dollar in Iran right now. They're having protests against Mr. Ahmadinejad. Something seems to be working, but could you ever see a scenario where you would support a military strike against Iran?
Well, that would have to come after much discussion. What I do not think is that we need Iran to be a nuclear power, and I think that Israel has been leading the discussion worldwide on that, saying that they keep passing these thresholds at which it becomes incrementally more difficult to stop the development of nuclear weapons inside that country. Again, just you're talking about the sanctions being effective in driving the dollar down. Look at North Korea. Mm-hmm. They let their people starve to death and still pursued agendas that would threaten destabilization of the entire world. And so the sanctions, until the sanctions stop the development of these nuclear capabilities, then I think we have to really look at them with a question about how effective they're actually being to stop the threat. Yes, they're causing pain inside Iran, but that didn't stop North Korea, and so the same sort of questions need to be asked here.
Mm-hmm. Does Iran have the right to develop their own nuclear power, in your view?
Well, not if they're going to destabilize the world.
Mm-hmm.
When the rest of the world is moving away from the nuclear weapons, absolutely think that the world has a right to say to Iran that until you develop internal disciplines that cause you to be a stable partner in the world, then yes, we, the world, will have a voice in that. If that's not the case, then we would say that any terrorist group who puts themselves over any particular country, finds themselves in possession of some of those nuclear weapons that have gone missing out of the former Soviet Union, we have to answer very significant questions if we say that the world does not have a right to step in and stop dangerous things that some countries are doing.
Mm-hmm. Just a few minutes left, but I want to get to a couple of quick things and buzz through. Keystone Pipeline, obviously very big in the news. How important is that Keystone Pipeline to New Mexico specifically?
It's important because what it does is it allows us to wean ourselves off of maybe Venezuelan oil, for instance. If we can buy oil from a stable trading partner, again, we're able to stop funding, to stop buying oil from Venezuela, which is very creating instability in the world and in the Americas. So again, for me, one of the keys is stability, and so the Keystone is important to every American because of this question of which countries we can buy from and who we can cut off our purchases from.
Mm-hmm. Climate change. Have you seen enough science to this point to agree that it's man-made, or are you still thinking we still need some more time, some more science? Where are you coming down on climate change these days?
Yes, the science that has come out, scientific bodies have found great problems with the hockey stick, for instance. They found great problems with the temperature base that the IPCC started with. And then those leaked emails showed that the scientists themselves were agreeing that they had to rig the game in order to make it seem more plausible and more readable. So the science is very, very undefined right now. And I do not think we should be raising people's taxes and their cost of living based on improper science.
I got to swing back to energy just because of the district that you're in, and it's just important for us here. Renewable energy production. Promote it, subsidize it. Where should the government fit in with this? And the secondary question to that is, do oil and gas producers still need what estimated about $4 billion in annual subsidies these days? Is there a balance here in your view for subsidizing newer energy sources as well?
Well, first of all, I support every form of energy, and New Mexico has probably all of them: wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, nuclear, oil and gas, coal. New Mexico has it all, and I support all. The question is what we're going to do in the way of helping industries along. I think in the presidential debate that Mitt Romney correctly pointed out that the president had sent $90 billion to firms, to green firms who had promised they're going to create jobs. They haven't created jobs. Many of the firms are bankrupt, and so it appears that we might have frittered away $90 billion. And so now you're asking about the $4 billion that goes to oil and gas. Keep in mind that goes mostly to small independent producers, and those generally are in areas where it would not be productive to produce oil and gas. And so the stimulations are very small. They're to a very targeted audience, and myself, I don't mind if we end up saying that we can't support that. That's fine, but understand that that oil and gas is where our economy grows right now. The wind and solar are decades away, according to the scientists who talk about it. Their ability to produce suitable wind or suitable power for our manufacturing facilities. Just understand that we're not going to be able to shut off of oil and gas and coal immediately. Otherwise, we do away with our ability to create jobs, especially in the manufacturing sector.
Congressman Pierce, we very much appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. Hope to talk to you again.